In the early 1990s, Barings Bank carried a name that sounded like history itself. Founded in the 18th century, Barings has financed trade, advised governments, and built a reputation around discretion and confidence. Inside such institutions, reputation is not decoration, it is a working asset. Clients choose banks they trust. Counterparties extend credit to names they respect, and employees inherit a culture that assumes problems are handled quietly and professionally. At the same time, finance was changing quickly. New products were growing in popularity, futures and options tied to stock indexes and interest rates. These instruments were not inherently dangerous. Used carefully, they could reduce risk by locking in prices or balancing exposures, but they also made it possible for small teams to take positions that were enormous compared with the capital of the firm, especially when oversight was weak and reporting was slow. Into this world stepped Nick Leeson, a young man whose career moved fast. He joined Barings and developed a reputation for energy and competence. In large organizations, speed often looks like talent, and talent often becomes trust. When someone is seen as getting things done, managers can become reluctant to slow them down with questions, audits, or procedures. That reluctance can be the first quiet crack in a system that otherwise appears strong. Leeson was sent to Singapore, where Barings operated a unit involved in trading derivatives linked to Japan's markets. Singapore was a major financial center with strict rules, yet the daily rhythm of trading still depended on internal controls: who approved deals, who recorded them, who reconciled accounts, and who checked whether reported profits matched real cash and real risk. A key detail in this story is not a secret method or a clever trick. It is something far more ordinary and therefore far more dangerous: the separation of duties. In well-run financial firms, the people who trade are not the people who confirm and settle those trades. The front office makes decisions, the back office checks them, records them, and ensures the numbers align with reality. The separation exists because humans, no matter how smart, make mistakes, and because incentives can quietly pull people toward optimistic reporting. In Singapore, Leeson gained influence over both trading activity and the supporting functions that should have monitored it. That overlap was not supposed to happen, but it did. Sometimes organizations allow exceptions when they are understaffed, growing quickly, or trying to save costs. Sometimes they allow it because the person in question is trusted. Either way, the effect is the same. The system loses its internal second pair of eyes. For a while, the results looked impressive. Reports suggested the Singapore operation was delivering strong performance. In a competitive industry, apparent success attracts praise, more capital, and more freedom. Senior leaders in London saw numbers that seemed to confirm they had found a star. Questions become uncomfortable when the story is good, and comfort is a powerful sedative. This is how many financial failures begin, not with noise, but with small permissions. A bank with a long history steps into a newer market. A young employee rises quickly. A team appears profitable. controls loosen just a little to keep momentum. The organization tells itself that everything is fine because the spreadsheet says it is fine. The tragedy of the Barings story is that the numbers were not a reliable mirror of reality. The structure around the numbers, how they were produced, checked, and challenged, was already compromised. And when a firm confuses reported success with verified reality, it becomes vulnerable to one of the oldest risks in finance, believing what it wants to believe. In the next part, we'll follow how that vulnerability grew inside day-to-day routines through paperwork, account structures, and managerial distance until the gap between appearance and truth became too large to ignore. To understand how Barings fell, it helps to picture a bank as a system of promises. Every trade is a promise about future value. Every report is a promise about what the firm owns and owes. And every internal control is a promise that someone has checked the promises. In Singapore, the activity focused on derivatives connected to Japanese markets, contracts whose value moved with the Nikkei index and related interest rate instruments. On paper, the operation could present itself as providing low-risk strategies, such as matching positions that offset each other. Many firms used such approaches legitimately, earning small margins while limiting exposure. When such strategies are real, the risk is controlled. When they are described but not truly verified, the description becomes a mask. The most important thing here is not the sophistication of the products, it is the simplicity of governance. Who sees the full picture? Who challenges a result that seems too smooth? Who insists that profits are confirmed by reconciled accounts rather than by internal statements? Barings struggled with those questions. Leeson's role expanded in a way that blurred boundaries. The same person who could influence trades also had influence over the records that explained those trades. In a healthy environment, a trader cannot quietly correct the paperwork after the fact. In a weak environment, paperwork becomes flexible, and flexibility becomes a hiding place. One symbol of this weakness was an internal account used to park items that were unexplained or in error. Many organizations have such accounts for temporary mismatches that occur in busy operations. The account itself is not suspicious. What matters is how quickly it is resolved and who is allowed to move items into it and leave them there. When a suspense account grows without strong explanation, it is a warning sign, like a smoke alarm that keeps chirping and is gradually ignored. As the months passed, the Singapore unit's reported performance continued to look strong. That apparent success reduced the likelihood of deep questioning. Distance also mattered. Senior leaders in London were geographically and culturally removed from the daily flow of Singapore's operations. They relied on summaries, and summaries can hide complexity. When oversight becomes a matter of reading a weekly number rather than interrogating how the number is built, the organization is trusting a dashboard without checking the engine. There were also incentives at play. Managers wanted growth in a new competitive market. A successful overseas unit enhanced careers and strengthened Barings' image as a modern institution, not merely a historical one. When incentives align with optimism, skepticism can feel like disloyalty. People may avoid asking hard questions because they do not want to be the person who slows down progress. Meanwhile, the market itself is never static. Prices move, volatility changes. The real world regularly produces outcomes that do not match tidy expectations. In such moments, a well-controlled trading operation shows stress but remains coherent. Positions are transparent, losses are recognized promptly, and leaders decide whether to reduce risk or accept temporary drawdowns. In a poorly controlled operation, stress invites concealment because recognition of losses threatens reputation, bonuses, and sometimes employment. A key educational lesson of the Barings story is how concealment can begin as an attempt to buy time. The mind can rationalize, I'll fix it next week, or the market will mean revert, or I just need one good month to get back to normal. The longer the concealment continues, the more psychologically difficult it becomes to stop. Eventually, the person involved may feel trapped by the story they have already told. In organizations, this psychological trap interacts with structural weakness. If no independent team is verifying positions, the concealment can persist. If leadership is focused on results rather than processes, the concealment can feel oddly sustainable. If reporting is fragmented across locations and systems, it becomes hard to assemble the full picture. All of this happened without theatrical moments. It happened through routine. Reports sent, numbers accepted, questions deferred. And that is exactly why it is so valuable as a case study. The collapse did not require a dramatic external event at first. It required only the slow erosion of separation, verification, and challenge. In the next part, we'll see how market pressure and accumulating exposure turned a fragile situation into an escalating crisis, one where the gap between what was reported and what was real could no longer be managed by routine. Financial risk has a way of remaining invisible until a moment arrives when it cannot be rolled forward. In the Barings case, the apparent success of the Singapore operation depended on the belief that positions were controlled and that any setbacks were small and temporary. But as hidden exposure grew, the reality became more like a spring being compressed. Each additional week of unverified reporting pressed the spring tighter. Derivatives positions can expand quickly because they are built on margin. A relatively small amount of posted collateral can control a much larger notional exposure. This is not automatically harmful, it is simply the design. The risk comes when exposure grows without clear limits, independent monitoring, and honest accounting. Without those, leverage can turn ordinary market moves into overwhelming losses. As the Singapore operation continued, it faced periods when markets did not behave as hoped. Instead of a clean, balanced approach, the positions became increasingly directional, meaning they depended on the market moving in a specific favorable way. Directional exposure is common in trading, but it must be openly recognized and sized within risk limits. When it is hidden, the firm loses the ability to choose. It becomes a passenger rather than a driver. At this stage, another dynamic appears: escalation. If a person believes they can trade back to even, they may increase exposure after losses, hoping that a future move will erase past damage. This is not a rational risk policy. It is a psychological response to fear and pride. In controlled settings, strict limits prevent escalation from turning into a runaway process. In weak settings, escalation can continue until the position becomes too large to unwind quietly. Barings also faced operational friction. Large positions require funding and margin. When a trader needs more margin, they must ask for it, and the request can attract attention. But if the organization is accustomed to trusting the unit's numbers, requests for funding may be interpreted as normal business needs rather than warning signs. When leadership lacks clear visibility into the true nature of positions, it may send resources without realizing it is feeding a growing problem. One of the most important educational insights from this period is that losses are not only financial, they are informational. A loss is data. It tells you something about risk exposure, market assumptions, and strategy design. When losses are hidden or softened through accounting practices, the organization loses that data. It cannot learn, it cannot adjust, it cannot even name the risk it is taking. And when you cannot name a risk, you cannot manage it. This is also where culture matters. In a culture that treats losses as shameful, people will hide them. In a culture that treats losses as a signal to investigate, people will surface them early. Healthy institutions do not celebrate losses, but they treat truth as non-negotiable. Barings in this story drifted toward a culture where the narrative of success was protected more than the integrity of process. As time passed, the gap between reported performance and true exposure widened. The bank's leadership and external stakeholders still saw the image of a profitable unit. The internal reality was a fragile structure supported by continued market hope and continued organizational trust. Eventually, the market delivered a shock that made concealment far harder. This was not the only cause of collapse, but it was the moment when accumulated hidden exposure met an environment that refused to cooperate. When the environment turns unfriendly, strategies that rely on just a little more time tend to fail. In the next part, we'll examine how that turning point accelerated the crisis, how liquidity demands revealed the scale of the problem, and why institutions that appear stable can unravel quickly when confidence and cash flow are both strained. When a bank is healthy, it can absorb setbacks because its leaders know the size of its risks and can act decisively. When a bank is fragile, it often doesn't realize it is fragile until it must meet obligations that cannot be negotiated away. In the Barings case, the crisis became undeniable when market moves and margin requirements combined to expose what reports had concealed. A trading position can feel manageable as long as it can be financed and as long as there is a plausible path to reduce it. But as the position grows, the cost of maintaining it rises. Margin calls are not moral judgments, they are mechanical requirements. The exchange demands additional collateral when prices move against a position, and it demands it on a schedule. You cannot postpone it simply by being confident. You must provide funds, or the position is closed at a loss. As conditions worsened, the Singapore operation required more and more funding. From the outside, these requests could still be interpreted as normal activity, especially within a culture that had accepted the unit's reported success. This is a subtle point. A single request for funding may not look alarming. It is the pattern and the lack of transparent explanation that should trigger investigation. When patterns are ignored, a bank can quietly move from profitable but volatile to unfunded and exposed without realizing it. At some point, the scale of the required funding becomes difficult to explain. The operation is no longer a small satellite, it has become a dominant risk engine within the organization. This is another classic institutional failure: concentration risk. Even large banks can be compromised when a single desk, a single strategy, or a single location grows beyond what the governance system can understand. Baring's reputation made the situation more dangerous. Reputations create confidence, and confidence can delay scrutiny. Counterparties may continue doing business because the name is respected. Internally, senior executives may assume that a venerable institution cannot be threatened by one overseas unit. This assumption feels reasonable until it is proven wrong. In modern finance, scale can accumulate faster than tradition can react. As the crisis sharpened, it also became harder to keep stories consistent. Internal questions became more pointed. Documents, confirmations, and reconciliations began to collide with the narrative of steady profit. When systems that were kept apart finally meet, when the recorded story meets the cash reality, the inconsistencies surface. This is where we should pause for a careful educational framing. The purpose of telling this story is not to spotlight cleverness or to romanticize risk taking. It is to show how institutions fail when basic controls and honest reporting are compromised. The most valuable skill in finance is not the ability to take risk. It is the ability to measure, communicate, and govern risk in a way that is transparent and accountable. In the Barings case, once the hidden exposure became visible, the bank faced a problem larger than a loss. It faced a trust crisis. Banks rely on trust in the same way bridges rely on structural integrity. When trust weakens, counterparties pull back, liquidity tightens, and the institution's ability to operate normally is impaired. Even if the bank has assets, it may not have time. Financial crises move at the speed of confidence, and confidence can change in hours. The end came quickly. Barings could not absorb the scale of losses and the funding needs associated with them. The bank, one of the oldest names in British finance, became an example of how modern risk can outrun legacy governance. In the next part, we'll look at what happened after the collapse, how investigations described the control breakdown, how responsibility was framed, and what enduring lessons regulators and institutions took from the event. When a historic institution collapses, people naturally look for a single villain and a single mistake. But the Barings story resists that simplicity. Yes, one person played a central role, yet the collapse also reflected institutional weaknesses that created the environment in which problems could grow. Understanding that balance, individual responsibility and organizational responsibility, is essential for learning the right lessons. After Barings failed, investigations focused on how oversight had been structured and why warning signs were not acted upon. A recurring theme was the breakdown of basic internal controls. Separation between trading and settlement was not properly maintained. Reporting lines were confusing. Monitoring systems did not produce reliable, independent verification. Senior leaders accepted high-level summaries without demanding detailed reconciliations that could have surfaced problems earlier. This is not just a story about a trader, it is a story about governance. In any complex organization, governance is the system that ensures reality is represented accurately to decision makers. When governance is weak, decision makers can be sincere and still be wrong because they are acting on incomplete or distorted information. Another theme was the role of incentives and pressure. In competitive financial environments, success is rewarded quickly and publicly. People who deliver profits become central to the story the organization tells about itself. That story can become emotionally important to leaders. It confirms strategy, validates expansion, and reassures stakeholders. When a story becomes emotionally important, it becomes harder to challenge. Investigators also highlighted the problem of remote management. Managing overseas operations is not only about delegation, it is about verification across distance, time zones, and systems. Verification requires investment, experienced staff, robust technology, routine audits, and a culture that encourages skepticism. When an organization expands faster than it invests in verification, it builds an elegant front with a weak foundation. Accountability followed legal and professional processes. Leeson faced consequences through the justice system in Singapore. Barings' leadership faced intense scrutiny for failures of supervision, yet the broader financial community also had to confront a painful truth. Many institutions had similar weaknesses, even if they had not yet produced a disaster. That is why Barings became a landmark case in risk education. From a modern perspective, the story also shows how risk is often misunderstood. People may think risk is primarily about bad markets, but the deeper risk is often organizational. Poor data, weak controls, concentrated exposure, and a culture that rewards good news more than honest news. Markets will always fluctuate. Controls exist because fluctuations are inevitable. The human dimension matters too. When a person is under pressure and believes their identity depends on success, they may hide problems rather than disclose them. Organizations must design systems that do not rely on perfect human behavior. Healthy systems assume humans will be tempted to delay bad news. They build structures that bring bad news forward anyway, early, calmly, and with clear responsibility. That design includes routine reconciliation, independent risk teams, mandatory vacations and job rotation in sensitive functions, clear escalation channels, and leadership habits that reward transparency. It also includes something less technical but equally important: psychological safety. When people believe they can report issues without humiliation, they report issues sooner. When they fear disgrace, they report later, if at all. In the final part, we'll bring these lessons into a clear educational framework. What institutions changed after Barings? What remains relevant today in trading, risk management, and leadership? And how viewers can recognize the early warning signs of governance failure in any organization, not only banks. The Barings collapse is remembered because it was dramatic. A centuries-old bank fell rapidly, and the trigger seemed to be a single trading operation. But the enduring value of the case is quieter. It teaches that modern institutions can fail for very old reasons: unchecked authority, poor verification, and the human desire to avoid admitting mistakes. One of the clearest lessons is that risk management is not a spreadsheet. It is a relationship between people, processes, and reality. Numbers are useful only when they are produced through systems that prevent optimism from becoming truth. A bank can have talented staff and still be unsafe if the structure allows one person or one desk to operate without independent challenge. Another lesson is that separation of duties is not a bureaucratic inconvenience, it is an ethical design choice. It says, we will not ask a person to be both performer and judge. When the same individual can initiate actions and also control how those actions are recorded, the organization is asking for trouble, not because people are always untrustworthy, but because incentives and fear can bend judgment. The story also highlights concentration risk. Even if a strategy appears small, it can grow quickly when leverage is involved. Institutions need limits that are enforced automatically and reviewed regularly. They need risk visibility that is consolidated across locations so leadership can see the full picture rather than fragments. They also need escalation protocols that trigger investigation based on patterns, not just on catastrophic events. Culture is the hidden engine behind these technical points. A culture that celebrates only profit can accidentally discourage honesty. A culture that treats problems as normal signals, something to examine, learn from, and resolve, creates resilience. The difference is visible in how leaders react when someone brings bad news. If leaders punish messengers, the organization learns to hide. If leaders reward transparency, the organization learns to surface issues early. Barings also teaches that trust is fragile and expensive. Banks, exchanges, and large firms operate on confidence. Once confidence is shaken, normal business becomes difficult. liquidity can tighten, counterparties can step back, and the institution can find itself in a fast-moving storm. This is why governance is not an internal matter only. It protects relationships with the outside world. For viewers, the most practical takeaway is learning to recognize early warning signs that apply well beyond finance. These signs include results that look consistently too smooth, a high performer who resists oversight, exceptions to standard procedures that become permanent, recurring temporary accounts that never clear, unusual funding needs that are poorly explained, and management that prefers optimism over verification. The Barings case also reminds us that accountability should be used for learning, not just blame. Individuals must be responsible for their choices, yet organizations must also examine the conditions they created. If the lesson becomes only one person did wrong, the deeper lesson is missed. Systems that rely on trust without verification are systems waiting for disappointment. In the years after Barings, the financial world strengthened controls and increased attention to operational risk, reporting transparency, and independent oversight. Those improvements matter, but the core truth remains timeless. Complexity increases the need for simple principles. Separate duties, verify independently, limit concentration, encourage honesty, treat risk as a shared responsibility, not a private burden. That is why this story still matters. It is not merely a tale from the 1990s. It is a reminder that institutions are only as strong as the habits they practice when things appear to be going well. When success feels certain, that is precisely the moment to check the foundations, because real resilience is built before the storm arrives.